Good morning. Everybody hear me? Thumbs up in the back? Okay, good. So again, thank you to our organizers for bringing us all together today to talk about what is a just city and creating and designing a just city. And then the second piece that is fascinating about it this morning is that opportunity to learn. What can we learn from our different perspectives about what each other does, and how can our work move us towards a just city? An initial observation is that I can learn a lot from our art historians and our architects about visuals. Because this morning I have no visuals for you, so bear with me because you're just going to have to stare at me for the next 10 minutes. Okay. Can I take this off? Is that all right? Okay. So this year's Dillon Symposium brings us together to address and confront the reality that the justice and the idea and the experience of justice in the American city is contested and imperfect. In the next few moments, what I'd like to do is talk about my perspective of what is a just city from a researcher in the public policy and public administration realm. Specifically, I'd like to do three things. Start with an overview of key questions that are of concern in the policy and administration realm when we think about justice. Share some observations from my own research on the role that organizations and institutional practices play in facilitating a just city, and then finally offer three examples of what we see on the ground right now in response to reversing some of the policy injustices that many of our residents in our cities have experienced in the past. So first, policy and administrative perspective. And yes, I'm going to try to do all of that in less than 10 minutes. So from my research perspective, when I think about what a just city is, I think of cities that are designed to promote social and political access for all residents. And I think thinking about those two together are critical, particularly if we reflect back to what Chief Brown was talking about, this notion of legitimacy in our communities and how important that is to build that trust between our government and our citizens. Those two ideas become melded together, much less than independent factors. So social access requires us to think about the social determinants of opportunity, such as the conditions in the environment in which people are born, live, learn, work, play, and age that affect their quality of life outcomes and their economic opportunities. So from this perspective, we need to ask ourselves, how do our cities influence these determinants for all populations? The second piece is the political access question. And that's important to ensure that all residents have the ability to understand and inform the values that guide the development of our cities, and that they feel that that value is being realized and that what is happening in our cities is legitimate in their eyes. Those questions require us to consider, how do our cities facilitate the opportunity for all populations to participate in that process, to inform and shape its vision and the implementation of its vision. So from the perspective of the work I do, building a just city requires designing organizations and institutions that facilitate social and political access for all populations. And questions of injustice must reflect on the previous shortcomings of our key organizations and institutions responsible for governing the collective. Most of us have experienced and seen some of the historical and contemporary injustices of cities in our societies. And many of those are filled with examples of organizations and institutions that were not designed with these considerations in mind. Cities have always been sites of contested space. Do we use land for highways? Do we use land for parks? Do we use land for high-rent apartments, such as Uptown, or affordable housing? Do we reduce the number of parking spots and reduce the size of our roads to facilitate walking to school, biking to work, or for recreational activity? Many of us will have different views and opinions on all of these things. And these are constant debates in the constant space that we face in these policy debates as it surrounds our cities. Historically, many of these decisions have led to choices that have resulted in outcomes that favored some populations over others, and often those with more social resources than others. So more critically, from a policy and administrative perspective, the question boils down to, how do we negotiate the myriad of interests and perceptions of what is a just city and provide access to all to inform what that vision should be? This pushes us to think about where the individual intersects with the collective and moves us towards a contested policy space in which our organizations and institutions can play a key role. Our past organizational and institutional failures have transcended both public and private organizations. From the perspective of the public sector, how we made policy decisions around major infrastructure projects, such as transportation in the 50s and 60s, and urban renewal projects in the 30s and 40s, are two examples of past organizational and institutional practices that created injustice. While both of these decisions had positive effects for many, this was not the case for all, and it drastically changed the shape of opportunity many face in our cities. For example, in the 50s and 60s, the interstate highway system had a major impact on our organization of urban and suburban space, accelerating growth to the suburbs, and cutting through and destroying many low-income and urban communities. Likewise, urban renewal programs, such as Mill Creek Valley in St. Louis, Missouri, cut through the heart of many low-income minority communities, destroying existing economic, cultural, and social relationships. These types of projects occurred during a time when policy did little more than allocate amounts of money to build interstate highways or allocate authority to local government agencies to declare land as blighted. Less emphasis was given to the establishment of institutional practices and processes to ensure inclusion of those directly impacted in the decision. Today, although transportation and housing policy has changed some in this regard, we now have over 155 mandates in federal legislation that require citizen participation in the process. We still see similar practices that continue to lead to the destruction of thriving neighborhoods, eviction of minorities, and negative social effects. Thus, a question we must consider when we're viewing our cities, when we're thinking about the role organization and institutional practices play, is what value criteria is used and prioritized in making these local decisions? And more importantly, what processes are adopted at the local level to authentically include the values of those who are most likely to be directly impacted by the process? So a fundamental challenge of building a just city is orchestrating a myriad of individual beliefs of what our cities should be. Sites of economic engines and growth, sites for arts, culture, physical activity, and diversity, sites for economic and social opportunity for all, into a collective vision of what it is for all and the implementation of that vision. While the decisions in our contemporary cities may be different, what remains as a critical component is effective organizations and practices that allow for authenticity, representation, and accountability in the creation and implementation of that vision. What I would like to do now in my concluding comments is offer 3 models of how local groups are trying to practice this and how some of our local agencies have responded through the processes they have adopted. The first is through the use of community-based agreements. A community-based agreement is agreement often negotiated between public agencies, private developers, and a community-based coalition that outlines a set of programmatic and material commitments that a private developer agrees to. They emerged in the late 1900s and 2000s as a new form of a public-private development tool. And we see common benefits included in these related to living wages, local hiring and training programs, affordable housing, environmental remediation, funds for community programs, and agreements related to public access to parks and open spaces. The goal of these tools is to ensure that development is equitable and that benefits all members of the community. The second example I'd like to provide is in regards to the use of community development block grant funding, which is a primary source of federal funds for doing community development work in cities. And this is a case of Cleveland, Ohio, and how they have linked their consolidated planning process to the allocation of CDBG funds. They have, in the city of Cleveland, they have a history of having a very robust community-based network of organization representing the myriad of interests around the city. These CDCs work on behalf of the urban neighborhoods throughout the city, have adopted processes and criteria to more strategically align the public planning process to the allocation of the CDBG funding resources. The Department of Community Development has increasingly worked closely with the Mayor's Office, the Planning Department, and key nonprofit leaders throughout the planning process to make sure that the priorities emphasized and that result from that process are then reflected in how they make funding allocations to particular projects. In doing this, they have adopted policies and procedures to enhance the transparency of the process, to reward collaboration among a number of different neighborhood groups, and to incentivize activities aligned with what those original goals and objectives were in the city plan. And then the final example that I want to provide is blending accountable autonomy with vertical equity. And this is the case of Minneapolis Neighborhood Revitalization Program. The goal of this particular program is to revitalize neighborhoods to make the city's residential areas better places to live, work, learn, and play. In Minneapolis, they sought to do this by empowering the residents of the neighborhoods to set local priorities, design projects, and implement them in collaboration with city departments. The 81 neighborhoods of Minneapolis, which differed greatly in population size, income level, and racial composition, were divided into 3 groups based on the decline in risk factors in their communities. Rather than distributing the funds equally to all neighborhood groups, the neighborhoods that were the most in need received the greatest allocation of resources. During this program and model, the idea of this program and model is the notion of accountable autonomy for neighborhood associations to have control over what they want their neighborhoods to look like, but also embedded in collaboration with the city departments to understand that the city is a place for all residents, all neighborhoods need to come together to some degree to share that vision. So in concluding today, what I've found in my research to date is community-based groups have played a key role in bridging this contested policy space and representing the interests of particular communities and neighborhoods in the decisions about what our cities look like. They've served as an important bridge to policymakers and government agencies, providing one form of representation for particular communities, and have also identified innovative tools and programs to facilitate social access. However, I think the second main takeaway is the need for local government and administrative agencies that are responsible for decision-making to adopt public processes that are authentic and establish criteria to ensure fair representations of these interests in the process. Thank you.